howled through the skeletal trees that lined the driveway of Ashwood Estate, their gnarled branches casting long, spindly shadows under the weak glow of the moon. The house itself loomed over the surrounding countryside, an austere relic of a bygone age, its stone facade weathered by centuries of wind and rain. It was here, within the confines of this ancient estate, that a crime both bewildering and terrifying had occurred. Detective Inspector Cray of the Melchester Police stood in the Grand Hall, his gaze sweeping across the scene before him. The body of Sir Edgar Lawton lay sprawled near the great hearth, his expression frozen in one of abject terror. A half-drunk glass of brandy rested on the side table, undisturbed. There were no signs of a struggle, no marks on the body, only the hauntingly peaceful image of a man who had, by all appearances, simply ceased to live. It was the setting that made the crime all the more perplexing. The doors had been locked from the inside, the heavy iron bolts drawn into place. The windows, despite their age, were firmly shut, their latches unbroken. The servants had been downstairs in the kitchen when the incident occurred, their alibis seemingly unshakable. No footprints in the freshly fallen snow outside, no signs of forced entry. It was in every conceivable way an impossible crime, and yet one clue remained, if indeed it could be called that. A single playing card lay beside Sir Edgar's lifeless hand, its edges crisp, its face revealing the image of a black queen. It had been placed there, no doubt, but whether as a message, a warning, or some cryptic mockery, no one could say. The servants whispered of ghosts. Old stories of Ashwood's tragic past resurfaced, tales of a woman wronged, a spectre that roamed the halls in search of vengeance. Sir Edgar himself had dismissed such superstitions, but there were those who swore that on the night of his death, strange sounds had echoed through the corridors. A laugh, a whisper, a presence unseen but deeply felt. Inspector Cray was not a man to entertain such nonsense, but even he could not deny the strangeness of it all. He had known Sir Edgar to be a man of rational thought, a skeptic by nature, and yet the sheer terror on his face suggested he had seen something beyond understanding. By morning, word of the mystery had spread beyond Ashwood Estate, reaching the nearby village of St. Mary Mead. And in that quiet little village, nestled among its rose-laden cottages and neatly trimmed hedgerows, there resided a woman who had a remarkable way of untangling such mysteries. Miss Jane Marple read the news of Sir Edgar's death over her morning tea, her keen eyes scanning the brief column in the local paper. A locked room, a dead man, a playing card. It was all rather theatrical, wasn't it? She folded the paper neatly, took a thoughtful sip of her tea, and made up her mind. A visit to Ashwood Estate was in order. The road to Ashwood Estate was slick, with the remnants of the previous night's rain, the sky still heavy with the threat of another downpour. Miss Marple, bundled against the damp chill, sat primly in the back of the hired car as it wound its way up the long drive, her gloved hands folded neatly over her handbag. Though she had never met Sir Edgar Lawton personally, she knew of him. A man of exacting standards, somewhat imperious, not particularly well liked by those who served under him. The village had whispered of his cold demeanour, his dismissive attitude toward those he considered beneath him. A man, in short, with no shortage of enemies. As the car pulled to a stop before the grand entrance, she took in the house with a discerning eye. It was an imposing structure, with thick stone walls that seemed designed to keep out not just the elements but prying eyes. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and old wood, the kind of scent that clung to places steeped in history. A uniformed constable at the door hesitated at her arrival. "I'm afraid this is a police matter, madam," he began, his gaze flickering uncertainly over her small, unassuming frame. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Oh, of course, my dear, I wouldn't dream of interfering. I merely thought to offer my condolences to Lady Lawton." The constable hesitated a moment longer, but there was something disarmingly gentle in her manner, something that made it impossible to turn her away entirely. With a small nod, he stepped aside, allowing her to pass. Inside, the house was hushed, its usual staff moving about in subdued silence. A maid scurried past, her eyes red-rimmed from either grief or fear. Miss Marple took in everything, the faint scent of cigar smoke lingering in the hall, the slight smudge of soot on the Persian rug near the fireplace, the way the grandfather clock in the corner ticked just a fraction too slow. Inspector Cray stood near the great hearth, deep in conversation with a man Miss Marple recognized as the family solicitor, Mr. Henry Markham. They turned as she entered, the inspector's brow lifting in mild surprise. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his tone carefully neutral. He had encountered the elderly sleuth before, and knew well enough that her presence at a crime scene was never mere coincidence. She inclined her head. "Inspector Cray. Such a terrible thing, poor Sir Edgar's passing. I do hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," he replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "We're still in the early stages of our investigation." Of course. So dreadful to die so suddenly like that, and in a locked room, no less. Quite the puzzle. Markham, the solicitor, cleared his throat. "Yes, a most unfortunate event. A heart attack, surely." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, but what a curious thing, Mr. Markham. A heart attack is rarely accompanied by a calling card." Markham stiffened. "I beg your pardon?" "The playing card," Inspector Cray supplied. "A queen of spades was found beside the body." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, "how very intriguing. You know, I once knew a dear woman who swore by card readings, always said the queen of spades was a warning. A harbinger of betrayal, she called it." She let the words settle, watching for reactions. Markham shifted slightly, adjusting his cuffs. "Well, I'm afraid I don't put much stock in superstition." "No, of course not," Miss Marple agreed amiably, though she noted the slight flush on his neck. The inspector exhaled. "The truth is, Miss Marple, we're not much closer to understanding how this happened. The door was bolted from the inside, the windows secure. There was no way in or out, and yet—" He gestured at the cold body still resting on the floor. Miss Marple stepped closer, peering down at the late Sir Edgar with quiet consideration. The terror on his face was undeniable, not merely the surprise of sudden pain, but a deep, raw fear. Her gaze travelled over the scene, the discarded brandy glass, the immaculate state of the room, the undisturbed dust on the desk, where a pen lay untouched, and then something curious. She bent down, her gloved fingers hovering just above the hearthrug. "Inspector, forgive me, but did you notice this?" Cray followed her gaze. There, just at the edge of the rug, was the faintest impression in the fibres, as though something had rested there briefly, something heavy enough to press into the thick weave, but there was nothing there now. "What do you make of it?" "The go?" Inspector asked. Miss Marple straightened. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of making anything of it just yet, my dear. Only, isn't it rather peculiar? A thing so small, so easily overlooked." She smiled gently. "And yet I do believe it may tell us a great deal indeed." Inspector Cray exhaled sharply and rubbed his chin as he studied the faint impression in the rug. "You have a sharp eye, Miss Marple." He straightened and cast a glance toward the gathered household. "If there's deception at play, we'll find it soon enough." The occupants of Ashwood Estate had assembled in the drawing-room, each one carefully maintaining a particular expression: shock, grief, nervous detachment. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across their faces. A long case clock in the corner marked the seconds with a measured, unrelenting tick. Lady Margaret Lawton, Sir Edgar's widow, sat with her hands folded in her lap, her dark mourning dress buttoned up to the throat. Her face, though pale, was carefully composed, her eyes dry. "You must understand, Inspector, my husband had many responsibilities. He was not a man who made friends easily." "A polite way of saying he had enemies?" Margaret's lips pressed together. "I would never speak ill of my husband." "But others might," Miss Marple murmured gently. She was watching Lady Lawton's hands, motionless, perfectly still. Not the nervous trembling of a grieving widow, nor the fidgeting of one desperate to conceal something. Controlled. "Where were you last night, Lady Lawton?" Inspector Cray asked. "In my chambers," she replied without hesitation. "The servants can confirm I retired early. I took one of my sleeping draughts, as I often do. I slept soundly." "A useful habit," Miss Marple said kindly. "A deep sleep can be a comfort, especially in a house so large and so very old." Margaret's head turned slightly, as though weighing the remark. A sharp cough from the other side of the room drew attention to Henry Markham, the family solicitor. He adjusted his cuffs and cleared his throat again. "This line of questioning seems unnecessary, Inspector. Lady Lawton is clearly not under suspicion." "That is for us to determine," Cray said. "Where were you, Mr. Markham?" Markham shifted in his seat. "I arrived yesterday afternoon for a brief discussion with Sir Edgar. Legal matters, estate planning. I intended to stay the night, but, well, naturally, I did not expect such a terrible event." "What time did you last see Sir Edgar?" "Just before dinner. He seemed in good spirits, though he was somewhat preoccupied with—" He stopped abruptly. "With what, Mr. Markham?" Miss Marple prompted, her voice warm and patient. Markham hesitated. "It was nothing of consequence. Merely some concerns over recent, how shall I put it, disputes over certain assets. But Sir Edgar was never one to entertain foolish accusations." "Accusations?" Cray latched onto the word. Markham sighed. Sir Edgar had been dealing with certain unfounded grievances from former business associates. "A man in his position inevitably makes enemies," Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "And yet, Mr. Markham, you said he was in good spirits?" Markham blinked. "Yes, that's right. A curious contradiction, wouldn't you say? If a man is troubled by grievances, one would hardly describe him as being in good spirits." The solicitor's jaw tensed. "I was merely speaking in general terms, Miss Marple." The room grew quiet. The fire crackled. A maid lingered near the doorway, hands twisting in her apron. Young, no more than 20, with wide, frightened eyes. When she realized attention had turned toward her, she startled and quickly dipped into a curtsy. "Begging your pardon, sir, Inspector, You are Ellen, correct?" Miss Marple asked kindly. "Yes, miss." You were working last night? Ellen nodded vigorously. Oh, yes, miss, I didn't see nothing, I swear it. I was downstairs with Cook and Thomas, the footman, miss. We was cleaning up after dinner. And? You heard nothing unusual? The girl hesitated. Tell the truth, child, Miss Marple encouraged gently. It's always better in the end. Ellen swallowed. Well, I did hear something, miss. Not a scream, nothing like that. Just... She bit her lip. Just what? Cray pressed. A voice, sir. Her fingers tightened on her apron. A woman's voice, I think. Soft, almost whispering. I thought maybe it was her ladyship, but... She glanced nervously at Lady Lawton. But when I went up to fetch something, the hall was empty, and Sir Edgar's door was locked. A woman's voice, Cray repeated. Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. How very intriguing. Tell me, my dear, were you frightened? Ellen hesitated, then nodded. It didn't feel right, miss. Gave me the, chills, it did. A house like this, Markham interjected brusquely, is full of draughts and echoes. A whispering voice could be anything. The wind, the creaking of old beams. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, or perhaps someone wanted to be heard by the wrong ears. Markham scoffed, but said nothing more. Cray turned toward Thomas, the footman, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a serious expression. You were with Ellen when she heard this voice? Aye, sir. Thomas's voice was steady. But I didn't hear a thing. Miss Marple studied him. And yet, you seem so very certain that it was nothing at all. Wouldn't it have been more natural to be curious, to investigate? Thomas's brow furrowed. It just didn't seem important, miss. Miss Marple nodded as though satisfied. But something about the way Thomas avoided her gaze told her otherwise. Strange thing whispers in the night, she mused softly. And even stranger still, who listens, and who pretends not to hear at all. Inspector Cray straightened. Thank you, everyone. That will be all for now. But understand this. We will uncover the truth. As the witnesses dispersed, Miss Marple remained by the fire, watching the flames dance. Inspector, she murmured, you have a curious problem on your hands. The woman who should have heard something, Lady Lawton, heard nothing at all. The girl who shouldn't have heard anything, Ellen, heard a voice. And the man standing beside her swears he heard nothing. Cray sighed. You suspect they're lying? Miss Marple shook her head. No, Inspector. I suspect they are each telling the truth, but not the whole of it. A flicker of realization crossed Cray's face. Someone is choosing their words very carefully. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. And that, my dear Inspector, is often the most dangerous deception of all. Miss Marple remained, by the fire long after the others had drifted away, her sharp eyes fixed on the dancing flames. Thoughtfully, she tapped a gloved finger against her handbag, the whispers of Ellen and the evasions of Markham and Thomas turning over in her mind. It was a tangle of half-truths and careful omissions, words chosen with precision, designed to conceal as much as they revealed. The problem was not a lack of motives, but rather an excess of them, each leading down a different path. Inspector Cray, arms crossed, stood beside her. I don't like it, he muttered. We have no clear suspect, no obvious means, and as for motive... He exhaled. Take your pick. Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. Motive is rarely simple, Inspector. People often act for more than one reason, even if they only admit to one. Cray ran a hand through his hair. Let's consider what we have. Lady Lawton stands to inherit the estate, though I hear Sir Edgar had been making adjustments to his will. That alone could be enough reason for her to want him gone. Possibly, Miss Marple agreed, but it would depend on the nature of those adjustments. If Sir Edgar intended to disinherit her, she might indeed be desperate. But if she knew nothing of it, then why would she act? Cray frowned. Then there's Markham. The man is far too guarded for my liking. As Sir Edgar's solicitor, he would have been privy to his financial dealings. Perhaps he had reason to fear exposure. And let's not forget the business rivals, Markham hinted at. Could Sir Edgar's death be connected to an old grudge? Quite intriguing, isn't it? Miss Marple mused. Sir Edgar himself may have held the key to that answer, but alas, we cannot ask him. She glanced at the inspector. Though I do wonder, was Sir Edgar a man who forgave easily? Cray let out a dry laugh. Not in the least. He was a man who made enemies, and then made certain they could never touch him again. Miss Marple nodded. And yet, someone did. She turned her attention to the footprints near the fireplace. That mark, just at the edge of the hearthrug. A chair, perhaps, or a small table. Something that was here and is now missing. Cray studied it again. You're certain? Quite, Miss Marple said, and I rather think it was moved with some urgency. The question is why? Before Cray could respond, the door creaked open, and Thomas, the footman, stepped in hesitantly. He looked at the inspector, then at Miss Marple, as if debating whether to speak. Something to say, Thomas? Cray prompted. The footman shifted on his feet. I didn't think it important before, sir. But now, well, I thought maybe you ought to know. Miss Marple smiled encouragingly. The truth, dear boy, is always important. Thomas swallowed. It's about the study, Sir Edgar's study. After the master went to bed last night, I saw someone go in. Cray straightened. Who? Thomas hesitated. Lady Lawton, sir. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened slightly around her handbag. That is interesting, she murmured. Cray's voice sharpened. You're sure? Yes, sir. I was locking up for the night. I saw her slip inside, quiet-like, with a candle. And how long did she stay? Not long, sir, 5 minutes, maybe less. She came out looking pale, and she went straight upstairs. Cray turned to Miss Marple. That's something, isn't it? It certainly suggests she had something on her mind. Miss Marple agreed. Though, of course, it does not tell us what. Cray nodded grimly. I think it's time we asked her. They found Lady Lawton in her sitting room, staring out at the grey morning sky. She turned as they entered, her face a mask of weary politeness. Inspector, she greeted, her voice steady. And, Miss Marple, what can I do for you? You can start by explaining why you entered Sir Edgar's study last night, Cray said bluntly. A flicker of something, fear perhaps, passed over her features. I don't know what you mean. Thomas saw you, Miss Marple said gently. There is no need to deny it, dear, but I wonder, what was it you were looking for? Margaret hesitated, then exhaled. It wasn't what I was looking for, Miss Marple. It was what I was putting back. Cray's brow furrowed. Explain. Margaret turned toward the fireplace, pressing a hand to her temple. Sir Edgar had suspicions about me, about my loyalty to him. She let out a short, brittle laugh. He searched my room sometimes, looking for proof of imagined betrayals. Last night, I found one of my letters on his desk, a private letter to a friend. He must have taken it earlier that day without my knowledge. Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. And so you retrieved it before anyone else could see? Yes, Margaret admitted. It was foolish, I know, but I had no desire to be accused of something that wasn't true. Cray frowned. This friend, who were they? A man? Margaret's expression turned cold. Is that what you think? That I had a lover? I assure you, Inspector, my friend is nothing more than that. And if you must know, she is a woman, a childhood companion who now lives abroad. Miss Marple observed her carefully. And yet you still kept this from us. Margaret turned away. Because it does not matter. Edgar is dead. And now you all think I wanted him gone. Perhaps I did, in my heart. But I did not kill him. Miss Marple studied her a moment longer before nodding. Very well, dear. But I do wonder, do you know anything about a missing chair? Margaret blinked. A missing chair? In Sir Edgar's room, Miss Marple explained. Something was there that is now gone. Does that mean anything to you? Margaret frowned slightly, then shook her head. No. But if something was moved, perhaps the servants would know. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Cray. There were still too many pieces that did not fit. Margaret had a reason to fear Sir Edgar, but not necessarily to kill him. And what of the playing card, the whispered voice, the missing object? As they stepped back into the hallway, Miss Marple's expression grew pensive. I do believe, Inspector, that our victim was afraid before he died. And when a man like Sir Edgar Lawton is afraid, there is always a reason. Cray exhaled. And the devil of it is figuring out what that reason was. Miss Marple smiled. Oh, we shall, dear Inspector. You see, the truth is rather like that missing chair. One only notices it by the space it leaves behind. Inspector Cray stood in the dimly lit study, fingers drumming against the polished mahogany of Sir Edgar's desk. The house felt different now, charged with an anticipation that was at once premature and deeply unsettling. Evidence had surfaced, damning in its clarity, or so it seemed. He should have felt relief, perhaps even satisfaction. But instead, a nagging unease coiled at the base of his skull. Across from him, Miss Marple sat in a high-backed chair, hands folded neatly atop. Her handbag, her expression betraying no more than polite curiosity. A discovery had been made, one that had seemingly broken the case wide open. Early that morning, Thomas, the footman, had found a pair of gloves tucked behind the firewood in the servants' hall. Not just any gloves, black leather, stiffened at the knuckles, bearing the unmistakable scent of gunpowder. And inside, just along the lining where the embroidered initials H.M. Henry Markham had not taken the news well. He had sputtered, raged, protested, but the evidence was irrefutable. The gloves belonged to him, and the presence of gunpowder residue all but confirmed their involvement in Sir Edgar's death. More damning still, upon searching Markham's room, the constables had uncovered a single playing card, the ace of spades, tucked into his travel case. It was the very same type of card found at the crime scene, a chilling replica of the one left beside Sir Edgar's lifeless body. Cray had wasted no time placing the solicitor under arrest. Now, as he watched, the fire flicker in the grate, he found himself glancing at Miss Marple, waiting for her to speak. She had been quiet during the ordeal, watching, listening. Too quiet. "Well, Miss Marple," he asked at last, "you've hardly said a word. I'd have thought you'd be pleased." She gave a small, thoughtful hum. "It is always pleasing when justice is served, Inspector. But do you truly believe it has been?" Cray frowned. The man's gloves were covered in gunpowder. The playing card was in his possession. What more do we need? "Ah," she murmured, "but you see, that is rather my concern. The evidence is, well, it is rather too neat, isn't it?" Cray sighed. "I suppose you think someone planted it?" Miss Marple gave a small smile. "Think, dear Inspector." "Oh no, I am certain of it." Cray exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "If you've a reason to doubt Markham's guilt, now would be a good time to say so." She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Consider the playing card, Inspector. It was left at the crime scene with great purpose, a signature, if you will, and yet an identical card was found in Markham's room. Now, I ask you, what sort of killer would be so careless as to keep a second calling card tucked into his belongings? It is rather like leaving one's name scrawled on the wall, don't you think?" Cray frowned. "A mistake. Or an arrangement," she countered. "Someone wanted you to find that card. Someone placed it where it would be discovered, knowing full well it would incriminate Mr. Markham." Cray hesitated, then shook his head. "And the gloves?" "A fine question," Miss Marple said, tilting her head. "But I wonder, why dispose of them so poorly? A guilty man would have burned them, thrown them into the river, destroyed them beyond recognition. But these, they were simply hidden. Hidden in a place where they would eventually be found." Cray muttered a curse. "If you're right, that means the real killer is still at large." Miss Marple nodded. "Quite so. And now that they believe the case is solved, they may feel safe enough to act again." Cray's expression darkened. "You think they'll strike twice?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Why, Inspector? I rather think they already have." Before he could respond, the door swung open and a constable hurried in, face pale. "Sir, there's been an incident." Cray's jaw tightened. "What incident?" "In the servants' quarters, sir. It's Ellen, the maid. They found her collapsed in the hallway, barely breathing." Miss Marple was already on her feet. "Poison?" The constable hesitated. "The doctor's with her now. They think it was something in her tea." Cray cursed under his breath. So much for an open and shut case. Miss Marple's gaze was distant, thoughtful. "You see, Inspector," she murmured, "the truth is often like a game of cards. The cleverest players know when to hold their hand, and when to play a false one." Miss Marple moved swiftly down the corridor, her steps measured but intent. The air in Ashwood Estate had changed. It was no longer just thick with suspicion, but with something far more insidious: fear. Ellen's poisoning had shattered the illusion of resolution, proving that the true culprit was still among them. And now the real question loomed: why Ellen? What had she seen? Or perhaps, what had she remembered? She entered the small servants' quarters where the young maid lay on a narrow cot, her skin ashen, lips cracked. The doctor, an older gentleman with pince-nez glasses, stood at her side, shaking his head. "She's stable for now. A dose of something bitter. Belladonna, I'd wager, though we'll need to confirm." Miss Marple's lips pressed together. "Will she wake?" The doctor hesitated. "In time." Whether she will be coherent enough to speak, I cannot say. Miss Marple nodded. That meant the answer lay elsewhere. Ellen had been silenced before she could share whatever she had discovered. But what had she seen that made her a target? As she turned to leave, her eyes drifted across the bedside table, where a cup of tea remained half-finished. The faint scent of herbs lingered in the air, but something else caught her attention, a torn piece of old parchment, crumpled and stained with tea. She picked it up carefully, smoothing it against her palm. The ink had bled slightly, but the words were still discernible. A name, Jameson, and beneath it, a date, 1892. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but inside something clicked into place. She turned to Inspector Cray, who stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Inspector," she murmured, "tell me, do you recall Sir Edgar ever mentioning the name Jameson?" Cray frowned. "Jameson? No, can't say I do." "Why?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the flickering candle on the bedside table. "Because I suspect we've been looking at this crime all wrong. This is not merely a matter of inheritance or blackmail. It is something much older, something deeply buried in the past." Cray sighed. "I don't like the sound of that. Do you think Ellen found something?" Miss Marple held up the paper. "She found this, and whatever it means, someone thought it was worth killing over." Cray took the parchment, studying it. 1892. That's nearly 40 years ago. What could possibly be relevant now? Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A great many things, Inspector. The past has a way of creeping into the present when one least expects." Her mind was already working, sifting through the possibilities. If the name Jameson was connected to Sir Edgar's murder, then it meant the roots of this crime stretched back decades. And that could only mean one thing. This was not just about who had killed Sir Edgar. It was about why. As they stepped into the hallway, the house seemed to press in around them, shadows stretching along the walls. Miss Marple paused for a moment, considering the family portraits that lined the corridor. Their painted eyes stared back, frozen in time, holding secrets that had long since been forgotten. Or perhaps, she thought, not forgotten at all. Lady Lawton stood at the end of the hall, arms wrapped around herself. She looked up as they approached, her expression unreadable. "Is she?" "Alive," Miss Marple answered. "For now." Lady Lawton exhaled, glancing away. "I should have left this place years ago." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "But you didn't." "Why?" Margaret gave a hollow laugh. "Duty, obligation, fear, take your pick." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Does the name Jameson mean anything to you?" Margaret stiffened. It was the smallest reaction, but Miss Marple caught it. A flicker of something in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps even dread. No, I don't think so." "Are you quite sure, dear?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "It would have been from many years ago. A connection to your husband's family, perhaps." Margaret hesitated, then turned away. "You should ask Markham. He knows more about Edgar's affairs than I ever did." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Cray before nodding. "Indeed, we shall." Markham, though still under suspicion, had been granted the comfort of his own quarters while the investigation continued. They found him seated in an armchair, looking weary but composed. He did not rise as they entered. "Come to gloat, Inspector?" he asked dryly. Cray crossed his arms. "You're not off the hook yet, Markham, but we have other questions for you." Miss Marple stepped forward, holding out the parchment. "Do you recognize this?" Markham's gaze flickered over the paper. His fingers twitched, just slightly, before he schooled his expression into neutrality. "Where did you find this?" "In Ellen's possession," Miss Marple replied, which means, of course, that she was never meant to. Markham exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Jameson? Yes, I know the name." "Then tell us," Cray said. Markham hesitated, then leaned back in his chair. Jameson was a man who once worked for Sir Edgar's father, a trusted steward for many years. But there was an incident, something Edgar never spoke of openly. The man disappeared in 1892 and no one ever saw him again. Miss Marple's brow lifted. Disappeared? Under what circumstances? Markham hesitated. There were rumors that he had stolen something, that he had been dealt with. Cray's jaw tightened. "You mean killed?" Markham didn't respond immediately. "I don't know. What I do know is that Edgar spent his life ensuring that no one ever mentioned the name Jameson again." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And yet someone clearly remembered, someone who was willing to kill to keep it hidden." Markham's face was pale. "If Jameson was murdered, then that secret has been buried for decades, and now it's resurfaced." Miss Marple nodded. "And I believe we are very close to understanding why." Cray's voice was grim. "Then we'd best figure it out, quickly, before the killer decides to bury another secret." Miss Marple sat quietly in the grand drawing room of Ashwood Estate, her knitting needles clicking softly. Though her hands moved with practiced ease, her mind was far from the neat rows of stitches she was forming. Instead, she was replaying every moment, every conversation, every seemingly inconsequential detail that had led them to this point. Jameson. A name from the past. A secret buried so deeply that someone was willing to kill twice to ensure it remained so. Across from her, Inspector Cray paced near the fireplace, restless as ever. "We need something concrete, Miss Marple. I feel as if we're grasping at shadows." She gave a small, knowing smile but did not look up from her knitting. "Sometimes, Inspector, it is in the shadows that the most telling things are revealed." Cray sighed, rubbing his temple. "We need to draw the real killer out. But how?" Miss Marple finally set her knitting down. "Tell me, Inspector, have you ever seen a guilty man give himself away without realizing it?" Cray snorted. "Plenty of times. They say too much, or too little. They fidget. They avoid eye contact." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. But have you ever seen one betray themselves when they believe they are perfectly safe?" Cray narrowed his eyes. "You have an idea." She gave a small, approving nod. "I believe so, but we shall need to stage a little performance." A few hours later, the grand dining hall of Ashwood Estate was alive with subdued tension. The family, the servants, and even Markham, who had been released under strict supervision, had gathered under the pretense of a final discussion before Inspector Cray declared the case officially solved. The poisonings, the hidden past, the ace of spades and the name Jameson, it had all led here. Lady Lawton sat stiffly at the far end of the table, hands folded in her lap. Her son, Julian, watched the room with a wary expression, while Markham, appearing resigned, sat with his arms crossed. Among the servants, Mrs. Harcourt, the housekeeper, glanced toward the doorway now and then. while Thomas, the footman, stood rigidly by the wall. The others, cook, young Sarah the scullery maid, and the gardener, Mr. Price, remained silent. Miss Marple, sitting comfortably near the head of the table, waited for just the right moment before speaking. "I must say Inspector Cray has been most diligent in his work. The case, it seems, is all but solved." A murmur ran through the room. Markham straightened. "Then I presume my name will be cleared?" Miss Marple offered a mild smile. "Oh, I do believe so, Mr. Markham. It would be rather unfair to accuse a man of murder when he was meant to take the blame, wouldn't you agree?" The shift in the room was almost imperceptible. Just a flicker of unease in a few faces. A glance exchanged between two individuals, a tightening of the shoulders. Miss Marple continued. "You see, I've given it much thought. The playing card was an interesting touch, far too theatrical for someone like you, Mr. Markham. No, the true killer wanted to create an illusion, one that would be easily believed, and for a time it worked." Cray folded his arms. "But then came Ellen's poisoning." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. And one must ask, why Ellen? Why not Markham, if he were the true threat?" Julian, who had been silent for most of the evening, finally spoke. "Perhaps Ellen saw something." Miss Marple smiled, watching him closely. "Precisely. And what she saw, dear boy, was something very old, something meant to be long forgotten." She lifted the parchment with the name Jameson written upon it. "Now, what I find so very fascinating is that no one seemed to recall Jameson at first, and yet I believe I've found a way to bring his memory back." She reached into her knitting bag and pulled out an old silver locket. It was tarnished, the clasp slightly bent. This was found tucked away in one of the attic trunks. Inside, it bears an inscription, "To my dearest J.J." Now, of course, that could mean many things, but I wonder, does that not seem awfully like Jameson? A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere down the table. A small reaction, but Miss Marple caught it. Her eyes lifted to Mrs. Harcourt. The housekeeper's fingers had tightened around her napkin. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple set the locket down gently. "And so I wondered, who in this house would have reason to remember Jameson? Who might have known him well enough to recognize the name even after all these years?" Mrs. Harcourt's knuckles were white. I wouldn't know, Miss..." Marple's gaze softened. "Oh, but you do, Mrs. Harcourt, don't you?" Silence thickened the air. Cray took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "Mrs. Harcourt, would you care to explain?" The housekeeper's shoulders rose and fell with shallow breaths. Her carefully maintained composure was unravelling. Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "You were a young girl when Jameson disappeared, weren't you? A maid in the household then, barely more than 16. And yet, you never forgot him." Mrs. Harcourt swallowed hard. I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but firm. "You cared for him, didn't you? Perhaps even loved him. And when he vanished, you were told never to ask questions. But you knew. Deep down, you knew he hadn't left of his own accord." Tears welled in Mrs. Harcourt's eyes. Miss Marple tilted her head. "And so, when Ellen stumbled upon something, perhaps an old letter, perhaps a record of some kind, you knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light." Mrs. Harcourt's breath hitched. Then something inside her seemed to break. "They killed him," she whispered. "Sir Edgar's father, and Edgar himself later." Jameson had found something, a debt, a forged document. I don't even know what, but they couldn't let it come out. So they... She cut herself off, shaking her head violently. Miss Marple's voice was soft. And when Ellen found his name, you were terrified history would repeat itself. Mrs. Harcourt exhaled shakily. I only wanted to scare her. Make her forget about it, but I didn't mean to. Her face crumpled, and she buried it in her hands. Cray signalled for a constable, his voice grim. Mrs. Harcourt, I'm afraid you'll have to come with us. As the constables escorted the sobbing housekeeper away, Miss Marple gazed once more at the locket. The truth, at last, had surfaced. Jameson's fate had been buried long ago, but in the end, the past had refused to stay hidden. As the constables led Mrs. Harcourt away, the room remained heavy with silence. The truth about Jameson had finally been unearthed, and with it, the tragic missteps that had led to Ellen's murder. Yet, Miss Marple did not look entirely satisfied. Her hands rested lightly atop her knitting bag, her expression pensive as her sharp blue eyes flickered across the faces around the dining hall. Lady Lawton sat as still as marble, her face drawn and unreadable. Julian's gaze was unfocused, as if staring through the walls. Markham, though now free of suspicion, remained tense, and Inspector Cray, though he had his man, or rather his woman, watched Miss Marple with a knowing look. He too sensed that something remained unresolved. Miss Marple cleared her throat delicately. I do believe we must remain cautious. Inspector, Cray frowned. Cautious? The culprit has confessed. Oh yes, Mrs. Harcourt has admitted to tampering with evidence and threatening Ellen, but you must forgive me if I feel there is still more to be considered. Julian leaned forward slightly. Surely you don't mean... Miss Marple smiled gently. Oh, I only mean that truth has a rather inconvenient habit of shifting when one least expects it. Before anyone could question her further, a sharp knock echoed through the hall. A constable rushed in, breathless, his face tight with concern. Sir, the evidence room at the station, it's been broken into. Cray shot to his feet. What? The constable nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. The locket. The letter with the name Jameson. The parchment from Ellen's room, all gone. A murmur swept through the room, the weight of realization settling over them. Markham let out a slow breath. Someone doesn't want the past coming to light. Miss Marple clasped her hands in her lap, her voice calm but firm. Inspector, I fear the truth we uncovered tonight is in danger of slipping away entirely. Cray was already moving toward the door. We need to get back to the station. But Miss Marple did not follow immediately. Her gaze lingered on Lady Lawton, whose lips had pressed into a thin line. The woman had hardly reacted to the shocking turn of events. No outrage, no fear, simply a silent, careful stillness. Miss Marple rose. Yes, I believe we must act quickly. The night was thick with mist as they arrived at the police station. The door to the evidence room had been forced open, the lock twisted and useless. Inside, cabinets had been rifled through, papers scattered across the floor. A window at the back stood ajar, an easy escape for the intruder. Cray swore under his breath. This was planned. Someone knew exactly what to take. Miss Marple stepped forward, surveying the mess with a keen eye. And yet, they did not take everything. She bent down, carefully lifting a single sheet of paper from the ground. It was crumpled, nearly torn, but legible. A copy of an estate ledger. Miss Marple scanned the text quickly. Ah, how very interesting. Cray peered over her shoulder. It's a financial record. Ashwood Estate's expenditures. Miss Marple nodded. A rather old one, dating back nearly 30 years. And look, there's an expense listed under construction. A payment made to a Jameson and Cobers. Cray exhaled sharply. Jameson was a builder? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Possibly, or he was owed money for a job done. Perhaps a job never meant to be recorded. Cray straightened. This means there's still a paper trail. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Precisely. Someone was in a dreadful hurry to erase the past, but as I always say, my dear Inspector, one cannot truly make history disappear. Cray turned back to the ruined evidence room. Then we're not just dealing with Mrs. Harcourt's desperate cover-up. There's someone else. Someone with far more to lose. Miss Marple's gaze was already distant, her thoughts knitting together the last remaining strands of the mystery. Somewhere in the past, buried beneath years of silence and deception, lay the truth of Jameson's disappearance. And someone with great power, was determined to keep it hidden at all costs. A heavy silence settled over the station as Inspector Cray turned over the estate ledger in his hands, his jaw tight with frustration. The missing evidence was a devastating blow. Someone had anticipated their moves and struck preemptively, covering their tracks with frightening precision. Miss Marple, however, seemed lost in thought, her fingers absently smoothing out the crumpled page she had retrieved. She glanced toward the open window, the cool night air filtering in, carrying with it a whisper of damp earth and rain. The hour. Past never truly vanishes, she murmured. It simply waits for the right moment to resurface. Cray exhaled sharply. Whoever broke in knew exactly what they were looking for. They wanted to erase Jameson's name. But why now? Because, Miss Marple said quietly, we were getting too close. A distant sound broke the hush, a sharp crack like wood splintering. It came from outside, beyond the station walls. The constable near the door stiffened. That came from the alley. Cray was already moving, his hand hovering near his revolver as he stepped out into the night. Miss Marple followed at a careful pace, her keen gaze flicking toward the darkened corners of the station's perimeter. The alleyway was slick with rain, the gaslight from the street barely illuminating the narrow passage. A door at the back of the station, normally locked and barred, now hung open, its frame cracked from a forced entry. Cray raised a hand, signaling for caution, then moved forward, stepping over the broken wood. Inside, the storeroom was in disarray, boxes overturned, papers scattered across the floor. And there, slumped against the far wall, was a man. Markham. Miss Marple drew in a sharp breath as Cray knelt beside him. Blood darkened the fabric of his overcoat, seeping from a wound just below his ribs. His face was pale, but he was still conscious, his eyes flickering open at their presence. He struggled to speak, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He's still here, Markham rasped. Cray's head jerked up. His grip tightened around his weapon as he scanned the room. The back exit, leading out toward the mews, stood ajar, the damp air whispering through it. Whoever had attacked Markham had been interrupted, but not before they had nearly succeeded in silencing him for good. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soft but urgent. Mr. Markham, can you tell us who did this? Markham swallowed hard, wincing as he tried to shift. Didn't see. Came from behind. His breathing hitched, then steadied with effort. tried to stop them. Took something from the desk. I don't know what. Cray turned to the constable at the door. Get the doctor, now! The young officer bolted, his boots echoing down the corridor. Cray exhaled sharply, glancing back at Miss Marple. This wasn't random. They came back for something specific. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already racing. The original break-in had been precise, removing key pieces of evidence. But this attack, this was different. It was rushed, desperate. Whoever had returned had done so under considerable risk, meaning whatever they had taken was of immediate importance. She turned toward the desk, now half emptied of its contents. Her fingers brushed over the remaining papers, her mind sorting through the puzzle. Then she noticed it, an empty envelope, crumpled and torn, its contents missing. Her lips pressed together. "Inspector," she said carefully, "what was kept in this drawer?" Cray frowned, stepping over. "That should have been where we put the copy of the old witness statements, the ones from 30 years ago." His face darkened. "The ones that mentioned Jameson by name." A chill settled in the air. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Markham, who was now barely clinging to consciousness. He had been trying to protect those statements, and someone still lurking in the shadows, was willing to kill for them. Cray straightened, his voice grim. "We've been underestimating our culprit. This isn't just about covering up an old crime. They're making sure no one ever finds out the truth, and they're willing to kill again to make sure of it." Miss Marple met his gaze, her voice quiet but certain. "Then we must find them before they strike again." Miss Marple stood amidst the chaos of the ransacked storeroom, her sharp eyes scanning every overturned box and scattered paper with quiet intensity. The room had been thrown into disarray, but disarray, she knew, could often be misleading. The thief, or rather, the murderer, had worked quickly, recklessly even, yet certain things had remained untouched. A deliberate mind had been at work. Inspector. Cray, his patience worn thin, paced near the door, his eyes flickering between Markham's unconscious form and the open back entrance. "We should have seen this coming," he muttered. "They were always going to come back." Miss Marple barely heard him. Her attention had drifted to a small, nearly imperceptible detail, a single sheet of paper lying just under the edge of the desk. Unlike the others, this one had not been swept aside or scattered in the haste of the attack. It had been left there, deliberately. She bent, retrieving it carefully. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the ink faded but legible. It was a signature log, old, from decades past. Her finger traced down the list of names, stopping abruptly when she saw one that stood out. Jameson. Her breath caught, just for a moment. The name had been written hurriedly, as if added at the last minute, and beside it, a second name, a witness to the signature, Lady Lawton. Her head lifted, her mind knitting together threads that had until now remained loose and unconnected. The Lawtons had always been central to Ashwood Estate, but Lady Lawton herself had seemed curiously detached from the unfolding events. And yet, she had been present all along. She turned to Cray. "Inspector, I believe we must speak with Lady Lawton immediately." Cray frowned but nodded. "You think she knows something?" Miss Marple folded the paper neatly and slipped it into her handbag. "Oh yes, Inspector. I believe she has known everything for quite some time." They wasted no time returning to Ashwood Estate. The night air had turned colder, the mist curling around the grand house like spectral fingers. Inside, the drawing room was dimly lit, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows along the walls. Lady Lawton sat in her usual chair, a glass of brandy untouched beside her. She did not seem surprised to see them. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Lady Lawton, I must ask you something rather difficult. It concerns Jameson." A muscle in Lady Lawton's jaw tightened. "Jameson?" Her voice was composed, but her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the glass. "I told you before, I barely remember him." Miss Marple tilted her head. "That is quite curious, my dear, because your signature is here right beside his on an estate record from 30 years ago." She withdrew the paper and held it up. "You witnessed something, Lady Lawton. Something important." A long silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Lady Lawton exhaled. "I suppose I did." Cray leaned forward. "Tell us." Her gaze drifted toward the fireplace, as if looking back into the past. "Jameson was a builder. My husband hired him for renovations on the estate. At least that was the official story." Her voice grew quieter. "But there was something else. My husband, he had secrets, and Jameson knew one of them." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with understanding. "A secret worth killing for, Lady?" Lawton closed her eyes briefly. "I was never certain. But Jameson disappeared, and my husband never spoke of him again. I signed that paper because I was there the last time Jameson was seen." She looked up, her expression weary. "And I have been waiting for the truth to come out ever since." Miss Marple's mind whirred. If Jameson had been silenced all those years ago, then the current crimes were not just about the past. They were about ensuring it remained buried forever. And there was only one person who had benefited most from keeping Ashwood Estate's darkest secret hidden. She turned sharply. "Inspector, where is Julian Lawton?" Cray stiffened. "He should be upstairs." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "Then we must hurry." Without another word, they rushed from the drawing room, ascending the grand staircase 2 steps at a time. The corridor leading to Julian's room was eerily quiet. Cray knocked once, then again. No answer. He pushed the door open. The room was empty. A single candle flickered on the desk, its wax dripping steadily onto the wood. The bed was undisturbed. And on the floor, half buried beneath the rug, was a torn scrap of paper. Miss Marple bent to retrieve it. A single word had been scrawled upon it in Julian's hand. "Jameson." She turned to Cray, her voice steady but urgent. "Inspector, I believe Julian has just made a very dangerous discovery." Cray's face darkened. "Then we need to find him. Now." Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the scrap of paper as she exchanged a knowing glance with Inspector Cray. There was no time to waste. Julian Lawton had disappeared, and she had a chilling suspicion that he was in grave danger. They hurried down the grand staircase, their footsteps muffled by the thick runner. Lady Lawton remained in the drawing room, her expression unreadable, but Miss Marple knew she was as aware as they were, perhaps more so, of the significance of what was unfolding. The past had finally caught up with Ashwood Estate, and it was demanding to be reckoned with. Cray gestured to one of the constables. "Search the grounds. If Julian is anywhere on the estate, I want him found." Miss Marple, however, had a different instinct. "Inspector," she said, lowering her voice. "I do not believe Julian has left the house. At least not willingly." Cray frowned. "Then where—" She turned her gaze toward the east wing. "The cellar." Cray hesitated for only a moment before signalling for 2 more officers to follow. Miss Marple led the way through the dimly lit corridors, past faded portraits of Lawtons long gone, their oil-painted eyes staring out in silent judgment. The air grew colder as they descended the narrow stone steps leading to the old cellars beneath the house. The door at the bottom stood slightly ajar. A faint creak echoed as Cray pushed it open. The air was damp, thick with the scent of aged wood and earth. Shadows stretched across the stone floor, but amidst them was a darker shape, motionless, slumped against the wall. Julian. Miss Marple reached him first, kneeling beside him. His breathing was shallow, his shirt stained with dust and something darker. Cray swore under his breath, signalling for one of the constables to call for medical assistance. Julian stirred, his eyelids fluttering. His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "I found it." Miss Marple leaned closer. "What did you find, dear boy?" His fingers twitched, and slowly he lifted his hand. In his grasp was a small, crumpled envelope. Miss Marple took it gently, carefully peeling back the brittle paper. Inside was a single sheet, old but intact. As her eyes scanned the writing, her breath caught. It was a confession. Not from Jameson, but from Lord Lawton himself. The letter, penned in an unsteady hand, detailed the truth that had been buried for decades. Jameson hadn't merely been a builder, he had been the illegitimate son of Lord Lawton, born of a scandalous affair. When Jameson learned the truth and threatened to claim his inheritance, Lord Lawton had acted, not to protect his wealth but to preserve his reputation. Jameson had been silenced, his body hidden somewhere no one would find, and someone, even now, was willing to kill to keep that secret. Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Inspector, we are dealing with far more than a murder to conceal an old crime. This is about lineage, about identity. Someone has built their entire life on a falsehood, and they are willing to do anything to protect it." Cray exhaled. Julian must have put the pieces together. That's why they tried to stop him. Julian's voice, weak but determined, interrupted them. "It's not over. They'll come back." Miss Marple squeezed his hand reassuringly. "Not if we stop them first." Footsteps echoed from above. Someone was coming. Miss Marple did not move as the heavy footfalls echoed from above. There was no panic in her manner, no alarm in her expression, only quiet calculation. She turned her sharp eyes to Inspector Cray, whose hand hovered over his revolver. The officers flanking the doorway exchanged tense glances, poised for whatever came next. But Miss Marple merely folded the crumpled letter in her palm, slipping it into her sleeve with a deftness that belied her age. "Inspector," she murmured, "whoever is coming down those stairs has realized that their secret is moments from exposure. They will be desperate, and desperate people are dangerous." Cray nodded, motioning for the constables to take position. "Chapfimi." Cellar door swung open, and Lady Lawton stepped into the dim light. Her regal bearing was intact, but something in her expression was cracked. Her composure stretched thin. Behind her stood Roger Ashwood, his face pale, his fingers twitching. "Julian," Lady Lawton breathed, her voice raw. Her eyes flickered over his weakened form, slumped against the wall, before locking onto Miss Marple. "You shouldn't have come down here." Miss Marple smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Ah, but you see, my dear Lady Lawton, it was inevitable, wasn't it?" She gestured gently to the cellar. "The past is a stubborn thing. No matter how deeply one tries to bury it, it always finds a way back to the surface." Roger swallowed, his throat bobbing visibly. "You don't know what you're talking about." "But I do." Miss Marple stepped forward, her small frame impossibly steady. "The confession in my possession is written in Lord Lawton's own hand." He admitted to silencing Jameson, but what he did not realize, what none of us realized until now, was that Jameson's claim was not just a threat to his legacy. She turned her gaze onto Roger. "It was a threat to yours." The silence that followed was suffocating. Roger's face contorted in something that was not quite understanding, not quite disbelief. Then, realization. "You've always known, haven't you, Lady Lawton?" Miss Marple continued, her voice softer now. "From the moment you married into this family, you knew the truth. Roger was not Lord Lawton's son. He was Jameson's." Lady Lawton let out a shuddering breath, but it was Roger who stumbled backward, as if struck, his hands curled into fists. "No, that's not—" He turned to Lady Lawton, pleading, "Tell her she's lying." But Lady Lawton said nothing. "You believed your father was a Lawton by birth, that the estate was your birthright," Miss Marple went on, her voice gentle, almost pitying. "But your claim was always a deception, and when Julian began piecing the truth together, you realized that everything you had built your life upon could be taken away in an instant." Roger's breathing turned erratic. "I didn't—" He shook his head wildly. "I didn't kill Jameson." Miss Marple inclined her head. "No, you didn't. That crime belonged to Lord Lawton, but you did kill Jameson's granddaughter, Margaret. You silenced her the moment she threatened to expose the truth." A strangled sound escaped Lady Lawton's lips. "Roger, tell me it isn't true," she whispered. But Roger was beyond words. His entire body trembled, his face a mask of unhinged fury. "I did what I had to do," he spat. "She was going to ruin everything, my name, my inheritance, my future." His wild eyes landed on Miss Marple. "And now you've ruined it too." His hand darted inside his coat. Cray reacted instantly, drawing his revolver. "Don't," he warned. Roger hesitated, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Then, with a desperate snarl, he turned on his heel, dashing toward the cellar stairs. But he had barely taken 3 steps before Cray lunged, grabbing him by the collar and yanking him backward. Roger flailed, but he was no match for the inspector. Within seconds, he was forced to the ground, his arms twisted behind his back as handcuffs snapped into place. Lady Lawton let out a choked sob. "Roger." Miss Marple exhaled slowly, watching as Roger thrashed once more before going utterly still. There was no fight left in him now. Cray straightened, his grip firm on Roger's wrists. "You're under arrest for the murder of Margaret Lawton and for the attempted murder of Julian Lawton," he said gruffly. "And if there's anything else you want to confess, now's the time." But Roger only turned his face away. Miss Marple glanced down at Julian, whose eyes were now open, watching the scene unfold. She knelt beside him once more, taking his hand. "It's over, dear boy," she murmured. Julian swallowed hard, nodding, weakly. "Thank you, Miss Marple," he whispered. She smiled, patting his hand. Ashwood Estate has harboured too many ghosts for too long. But now, at last, the past can rest. As the rain lashed against the high windows of Ashwood Estate, the tension in the drawing room remained thick, the weight of the evening's revelations pressing heavily upon those who remained. Roger had been taken away in handcuffs, his protests dwindling into bitter silence. Lady Lawton sat unmoving by the hearth, staring into the flames as though they might consume the terrible truth that had unravelled before her. Julian, still weakened, had been moved to a nearby chaise, his fingers trembling as he held a cup of tea Miss Marple had insisted he take. Inspector Cray, for his part, was already discussing the formalities of the case with his constables, his gruff satisfaction evident in the set of his jaw, and yet Miss Marple did not share in his sense of finality. Her gaze flickered to the grand portrait of Lord Lawton above the mantel, his cold, austere expression betraying nothing, and yet she could not shake the sense that something remained unfinished. There had been relief, yes, when Roger had confessed to Margaret's murder. The puzzle pieces had fit together, his desperation, his need to silence her before she could expose his illegitimacy. But something still nagged at her, a faint, elusive thread of inconsistency. Her fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. "Inspector," she said at last, her voice light but firm, "there is something we have all overlooked." Cray glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "What are you getting at, Miss Marple?" She smiled, though there was little mirth in it. "Simply this. Roger Ashwood is guilty of murder, but I no longer believe he was acting alone. In fact," she paused, her gaze sliding toward Lady Lawton, "I do not believe he was the true mastermind at all." Lady Lawton's head jerked up, her red-rimmed eyes widening. "What? But you heard him. He admitted it." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, but did he really? He confessed to killing Margaret, certainly, but not once did he admit to poisoning Julian. And therein lies the inconsistency. You see, Lady Lawton, Roger had everything to lose if his true parentage was exposed, yes, but not if Julian died before he could tell the world." Silence rippled through the room. Julian stiffened, his knuckles whitening around the porcelain teacup. Cray straightened, his sharp eyes narrowing. "But," Miss Marple continued, "Julian was attacked after Margaret had already died. That alone should have struck us as odd, should it not? If Roger had already silenced the one person threatening his inheritance, why would he need to eliminate Julian as well? The threat was gone, or so it seemed." Cray exhaled sharply, realization dawning. Then the attempt on Julian's life wasn't Roger's doing. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Precisely. And that, Inspector, tells us that someone else, someone who had just as much, if not more, to lose, was still trying to keep the truth buried." All eyes turned, almost as one, to Lady Lawton. She let out a broken laugh, shaking her head. "This is madness. My own son is lying there, barely recovered, and you think I—" "Yes," Miss Marple said simply. A hush fell over the room, heavier than the storm beyond the walls. Lady Lawton trembled, her gaze darting about as though searching for an escape. I only wanted to protect him," she whispered. "Everything I did, it was for him." Julian inhaled sharply. "Mother, you must understand." Lady Lawton turned to him now, her voice frantic. "Margaret was going to destroy us. She came to me first, not Roger. She threatened me, Julian. She said she would go to the papers, that Ashwood Estate would be dragged through scandal. She wanted money, but she wanted something else too. She wanted to see us suffer, to make us pay for what her grandfather lost. She forced my hand. Miss Marple remained unflinching. And so you poisoned Julian, knowing that his sudden death would cast a shadow over any scandal Margaret might have stirred. You knew Roger was reckless, that he would lash out, that suspicion would inevitably fall upon him for Margaret's death. But if Julian were gone, the secret would be buried once and for all, and Roger would still inherit. The estate would remain in the family. Lady Lawton swayed, her face ashen. Cray stepped forward. Lady Lawton, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of Julian Lawton and conspiracy to commit murder. Lady Lawton let out a strangled sob, collapsing into a chair. I never wanted it to go this far, she whispered. Miss Marple sighed, a quiet, weary sound. And yet it always does, my dear. Secrets have a way of demanding their due. The past is never as buried as we wish it to be. Julian turned away, his expression unreadable. As the constables moved forward to take Lady Lawton into custody, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet contemplation. The storm outside had begun to ease, the wind no longer howling against the windows, but inside Ashwood Estate the damage had already been done, a family torn apart by its own ghosts, a history that could no longer be rewritten. She sighed again, rising from her chair with a gentle shake of her head. Ashwood will endure, she murmured, but at what cost? As the rain softened to a gentle patter against the great stone walls of Ashwood Estate, the weight of the night's revelations settled over those who remained. Lady Lawton sat motionless in her chair, her fine silk gown now crumpled, her hands twisted together in her lap. The veneer of aristocratic composure that had upheld her for so long had finally cracked, leaving only a woman haunted by the ruin she had wrought upon her own family. Inspector Cray wasted no time. He signalled to his men, and they stepped forward, their boots muffled against the thick Persian rug as they moved to take her into custody. Lady Lawton, he said, his voice measured but firm, you will be escorted to the station, where formal charges will be filed against you. She did not resist. There was no point. Slowly she rose, her gaze flickering to Julian, who stood with a haunted expression, his hands clenched at his sides. Julian, she whispered, her voice barely audible, I did this for you. Julian swallowed, hard. No, Mother, he said, his tone raw. You did this for yourself, and now we all have to live with it. The constables led her away. The sound of their departure echoed down the long hall, until only the crackling of the fire remained. Miss Marple exhaled softly, watching the flames flicker against the polished brass. A terrible thing, when love turns to possession, she murmured. She convinced herself she was saving her son, but in the end she destroyed the very thing she sought to protect. Julian turned away, staring at the darkened window. And Roger, he asked, his voice hollow. Will face justice for Margaret's murder, Cray answered. His confession will stand. And with Lady Lawton's attempts to frame him as the sole perpetrator, a jury will not look kindly on him. Julian gave a short, bitter laugh. Justice, he muttered. A fine thing, that. Miss Marple studied him for a moment. You will inherit Ashwood now, she said gently. He laughed again, shaking his head. Yes. The estate is mine, but at what cost? The room fell silent. The grandeur of Ashwood, its legacy stretching back generations, had always seemed untouchable. And yet, beneath its stately beauty, it had harboured deception, greed, and now ruin. Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to the great portrait above the hearth, the late Lord Lawton, his expression as unyielding in paint as it had been in life. "It is a strange thing, inheritance," she said softly. "Sometimes it is not land or wealth that we inherit, but the sins of those who came before us." Julian's expression tightened. "Then perhaps it is time to break the pattern," he said. "Time to let the past rest." Miss Marple nodded approvingly, though she knew that the past never truly rested. It only waited hidden beneath the surface until the next storm came to stir it up once more. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the dawn light stretched pale fingers across the rolling moors. Another case solved, another tragedy laid bare. But, as Miss Marple reached for her knitting, she could not shake the faintest whisper of unease, because justice had been served, yes, but at Ashwood Estate, the ghosts of old secrets never truly faded. As the sun began its slow ascent over Ashwood Estate, casting long golden rays through the morning mist, Miss Marple stood at the edge of the great gravel drive, her hands lightly folded over the handle of her small handbag. The storm had passed, both within the walls of Ashwood and beyond, yet an odd sense of unfinished business clung to the air, like the last wisps of fog reluctant to fade. The constables had departed with Lady Lawton, her elegant profile visible, just for a moment through the carriage window before it turned toward the village. Julian remained inside, a man now burdened with a legacy tainted by secrets and tragedy. The estate, with its high walls and ivy-laden corridors, would belong to him alone. Whether that was a blessing or a curse remained to be seen. Miss Marple turned slightly as Inspector Cray joined her. He exhaled, adjusting his coat against the morning chill. "Quite the case, Miss Marple," he admitted. "You have my thanks." She smiled, the kind of smile that barely touched the corners of her lips. "I am always glad to be of assistance, Inspector," she said, "though I fear I shall never quite grow accustomed to such unhappy affairs." Cray nodded, rubbing a hand over his chin. "At least it's over now," he said. Miss Marple hesitated, glancing back toward the house. "Yes," she murmured, "I suppose it is." And yet, there it was, that familiar nagging sensation like an itch at the back of the mind. She had felt it before, after many a case when the conclusion was reached and the guilty led away. And yet something remained unsettled. It was not suspicion, not exactly. More like a whisper in the silence, a piece of a puzzle that had not quite been placed. She cast her mind back over every detail. Lady Lawton's desperate confession, Roger's cold and calculating attempts to mislead, Julian's hollow sorrow, the tangle of deception that had been unravelled before them all. And yet, her eyes flickered toward the great oak doors, still, slightly ajar, as though the house itself was unwilling to fully close on the matter. Cray noticed her expression and frowned. "Something the matter?" Miss Marple let out a thoughtful hum. "Tell me, Inspector," she said. "Do you believe in ghosts?" He looked at her, startled, before chuckling. "No, can't say I do. Though I imagine a house like this has no shortage of tales." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze still fixed on the doors. "Indeed, ghosts are often spoken of in places such as these, restless spirits, lingering unfinished business." She paused, choosing her words carefully. And yet, I have found that more often than not, ghosts are merely the shadows of things people would rather forget. Cray tilted his head slightly, watching her. Are you saying we've forgotten something? Miss Marple let her fingers play absently over the delicate clasp of her handbag. Not forgotten, perhaps, she said, but overlooked. And then, just as quickly as the thought had come, it was gone, slipping away like the last drops of rain down the grand stone steps. Whatever it was, it would remain hidden, for now. She turned back to Cray, offering him a polite smile. But that is no concern of ours at the moment, is it, Inspector? The matter is closed. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. Yes, I suppose it is. She inclined her head, then stepped forward, her boots crunching lightly against the gravel as she made her way toward the waiting carriage. She climbed in, settling herself as the driver gave a slight nod and took up the reins. The horses stirred, and as the carriage began its slow departure from Ashwood Estate, Miss Marple allowed herself one last glance back at the grand house standing, tall against the morning light. Yes, the matter was closed, but mysteries she knew never truly ended. They only waited for someone to find them again.